Hi, this is Craig Stocks here at Utah Desert Remote Observatories. You can find us online at utahdesertremote.com. And today we're going to look at the data for this image of the Dolphin Head Nebula. And we're going to process it in both PixInsight and Photoshop, but I want to show a couple of what you might think of as exit points where you can process it very simply, or you can get a little bit more complex and advanced in your processing, whatever you're comfortable with and whatever gives you the image you're looking for. So let's jump into PixInsight and Photoshop. As always, we'll start in PixInsight, and this data was captured again for an hourly rental customer, and I'm producing this video with his permission to use his data. And I'll start by looking at the setup for WBPP, and you can get to that by script, batch processing, weighted batch pre-processing. And in this case, I sent him 2 or 3 nights worth of data. And we want to combine all 3 nights into one run of WBPP along with the calibration data. So the first thing I'm going to do is reset the WBPP tool found under Script, Batch Processing, Weighted Batch Preprocessor. And I'll click to reuse the settings from the last session and clear all the file lists. That gets us a fresh start. And let's start by loading the light frames. And I mentioned we have a couple nights worth of data. So to add data, we'll go to the Lights tab and click on the plus lights at the bottom and navigate to the folder where that data is located. And that's on my Astro folder. This was captured with the Dream astrograph. There's the Dolphin. So this is the 3rd night. We'll open these, click on one, shift click on the rest. And I have already gone through and removed the bad frames. Now we'll click on plus lights again. Typically I would start by going through blank and removing any frames that were not usable or not ideal. We'll select the 8th. Select all of those, which I'm doing with Control A. And then lastly, we'll do a plus lights again. And this time we'll go to the first night in the run, which would be, what is that, the 6th. And once again, we'll select both of these. We didn't have a very good night that night. We only got 2 images. Now, I need to load bias, dark, and flat calibration frames, and what I typically do is send calibration masters. And those are all in one folder, so we can load those all at once by just clicking on the plus directory tab rather than loading bias, darks, and flats individually. And I can just navigate to wherever I have that information stored. And in my case, it's stored again, in my Astro folder. I have a folder for calibration masters, and here are the calibration masters for the Dream scope. Select that folder, and PixInsight will load those calibration masters in the appropriate places. So there's the flats, the darks, and the bias masters. Now let's go to the calibration tab and finish the setup. We need to make a couple of simple settings. And actually, before I do it, let's go back to the Lights tab. Different people have different approaches to what they want to include or not include. The way I have mine set up, for subframe weighting, on the Lights tab, I have PSF signal weight. For image registration, if you click on the registration parameters, I'm using the bicubic B-spline as the pixel interpolation method. And I have distortion correction enabled. That's usually not needed, but sometimes it's helpful. I have the astrometric solution checked, but I have not checked interactive in case of failure. If the astrometric solution fails, then we'll deal with that later. I do not use local normalization, and then I have image integration checked. So let's now go to the calibration tab and click on one of the light frames, and you'll notice that when you click on any frame, the information in the center tab changes. For instance, if I click on the flats, we have settings that are appropriate for the flats. So if I click on the hydrogen light frames, you can look at the output pedestal settings, and right now it's set for literal value in 0. I want to change that to 300 and apply that to all light frames. And what that means is it applies it to each one of these rows. And then lastly, we'll set the registration reference image to auto, and we'll change the output directory. This is the working folder where PixInsight stores all of the intermediate calibrated and registered and ultimately the master files. So I'll select that. And if you're curious, you can always look at the post-calibration tab, and one of the interesting things it gives you is the number of frames by filter, or if you have different exposure times within a filter, those would typically be broken out also. But it also tells me the total integration time is 4 hours and 4 minutes, which is not a whole lot, but it's enough to get a pretty good image. So with that, we would just click Run and see if there are any errors. In this case, it's telling me that my working space is not sufficient, so I need to go back and free up some space on this D drive. Now, in reality, I've already run this, so I'm not actually going to run it again. So what I'm going to do is pause and go clean up some space on my D drive, and then we'll pick up as if WBPP had just finished. Okay, I've made some working space on my D drive, and like I mentioned, I have already run this, so we won't actually run WBP again. So we can exit from this, and actually after it runs, you'll get a couple of confirmation windows, and then it will bring you back to this window. So now let's load the master lights, and to do that, I usually just double-click here on the background, and that'll bring up the Open Image dialog, where we can navigate to whatever file we want to open. And this is going to be in my swap files folder under the Dolphin, and then there's a folder. If we look at the structure there, we can see that there's calibrated, debayered, logs, master, and registered. And basically what WBPP does, it goes through and first it calibrates all of the light frames. So if we look in the calibrated folder, we'll see there's actually a folder in here for each one of those red, green, blue, H, and O. And then it'll do the same thing for the debayered. It will go through and debayer or turn the image into a color image. From calibrated, it goes into debayered. From debayered, it will register the image, and then eventually it will integrate or stack those registered image, and that shows up in the master folder. And what we're looking for here are the red, green, blue, oxygen, and hydrogen. So these 4 files, I'll click Open. So this was imaged with RGB, hydrogen or HA, and oxygen or O3. So we have a couple different ways we can go with the data. We can produce just a simple HOO image, and that's by far the easiest thing to produce. We can produce an RGB image, which is equally easy, but doesn't show as much detail. But it does have a better chance of having what would be considered the correct color for the stars. Or we can produce a hybrid where we have a HOO image of the nebula and then an RGB image of the stars. And eventually that's where we will end up. But to start with, let's think about doing this just the simplest way possible. So here are the 5 files that are in the master folder, RGB, and then the hydrogen and the oxygen. And you'll notice they're very dark, and we need to stretch these files or brighten the image in order to see what's there. Brightening the image ultimately is a destructive process. In other words, once you stretch it, you can't really unstretch it. So what we want to do before we do any real significant operations, we want to keep it in its natural linear state, unstretched state, but we need to be able to see what we're doing. And so PixInsight provides a screen transfer function or an auto stretch. And basically what it does is it will give you a preview of what that image looks like if it were stretched, but it doesn't actually stretch the image. And we can activate that with a little monitor symbol with a radioactive symbol on it. And if you hover over that, you'll get a tooltip that says STF Auto Stretch. STF stands for Screen Transfer Function. And if I just click on that, you can see now it has brightened this image so we can see what's actually there. And there's a little green bar over on the left-hand side as an indicator that this is an auto-stretched image. And let's just briefly do the same thing with the hydrogen. And it looks a little different, similar but a little different. So the simplest thing we could do with this is just take these two images and combine them into an HOO image. And we can do that with the channel combination tool, which you can find under Process, All Processes, Channel Combination, right there. And let me just reset it so we'll start from scratch. Basically, the inputs to channel combination is what do you want to use for the red, what do you want to use for green, and what do you want to use for blue. If we're going to do an HOO image, then we want H in the red channel and oxygen in the green and blue channels. That's why it's called HOO. And right now we have the oxygen image on top. We can populate this two different ways. You can use the little drop-down dialog over here and choose the oxygen file or oxygen view. You can also come over to the tab on the left-hand side of the image and click and drag that into the box to populate it. And let's do the same thing now with the hydrogen. We'll drag it in. So now we have hydrogen being used for red and oxygen being used for green and blue. In order to execute that, we'll just click the solid circle, and that will execute this and create a new file called image 6. And if we auto stretch image 6, we'll see that it's now a color RGB image that's made up of the hydrogen and oxygen. And it's somewhat overwhelmed by the hydrogen and oxygen signal, so we need to do some neutralization. A real simple neutralization that's not included with PixInsight, but it's available at no cost, is Graxpert. And that works very well on images like this. And Graxpert is a separate program when you download it and install it. So the older way of doing it is you would have to save this file, go to Graxpert, load the file, process it, save it, come back to PixInsight, load it again. There's now a toolbox that automates that process for you, which you can get to if you install Graxpert and then install the toolbox under Script, Toolbox, Graxpert. And I have just default settings other than we have to tell Graxpert, the Graxpert tool, where Graxpert's actually installed, and it can usually find it itself. And then there's a value here for smoothing that I have set around 0.2. And for me, that works better than the default, which is 0. So we can just apply this by clicking the checkbox. And you can see the current image is image 6. So let's click that. And it will run Graxpert, which removes gradients and also neutralizes the background. And it'll give us a neutral looking image. So it's just about done. And there we go. So that now looks like a completed HOO image. If you have some of the Russell Croman tools, such as Star Exterminator or Noise Exterminator or Blur Exterminator, this would be a good place to use those. But you can just stretch this, save it, and you're done. So in order to stretch it, if we want to take this, just the easiest way, we've created a simple HOO image. I like to do the stretch using actually the tools in the screen transfer function. And you can open under Process, and let's just go to All Processes, Screen Transfer Function. And you get a dialog box that looks like this. And we want to make sure now that the channels are linked, which you do by the little link icon here. And if I click the radioactive button, it updates the screen transfer function estimate of how it should stretch it. And that looks pretty good. I would like to actually darken the background a little bit. So you can use these little plus and minus tools. If I click on the plus, and what it does is zoom in on these sliders. And if I click in between them, it'll spread them apart a little bit. And if I get them too far apart, I can go to the minus and bring them back in. And then I can go to the pointer tool, and I can click and drag these tools back and forth if I want to darken the background. Now, you don't want the background to be black. And as a reference, the background here is probably black on these sliders of the screen transfer function. So you don't want this background of the image to be as dark as that. And you also want to be careful you don't have anything that looks pure white. But you can just play with these sliders and get it to look better than it does. Now, the problem is we can't actually apply this directly to the image. In order to apply it to the image, we need to use another tool. And that tool is going to be found under Process, All Processes. And this is the histogram transformation tool. And what we can do with it, and let me just quickly reset the tool. Here you can see a straight line that shows how the histogram transformation is going to transform the data in the file from where it is as an input to some new output. And it's going to do it by brightening the image. Now, we already have figured out some settings for how we want to brighten the image. So we can just use these settings in the histogram transformation tool, but we have to get the settings from the screen transfer function tool into the histogram transformation tool. And we do that by grabbing the little triangle on the lower left of the screen transfer function, drag it down to the bottom bar of the histogram transformation, and if you watch that straight line that goes across the center, as soon as I release my mouse, you'll see it pop into a very strong curve. And it's this curve that is the transformation that's going to be applied. In order to apply it now, we'll click on the square triangle, or I'm sorry, the square, and that will actually apply it. Now the image will turn white, and the reason it does that is we've now stretched the image, we've applied this curve, but we're also still looking at it as through this screen transfer function. And we know we're looking at an auto-stretched image by the green bar. So if I use the icon on the left side of the STF tools, that will remove the auto-stretch. And we now have a fully stretched image that's ready to go. So at this point, you can just go to File, Save As, save this as a TIFF or a JPEG or whatever format you want to save it in. And I think for my purposes, I'll just go to my D drive and Astro Dreamscope data. There's the Dolphin. And let's save this as a JPEG. And we're going to call this a simple HOO image. Now again, if you have the Russell Croman's tools, you can also run Noise Exterminator. And typically you would run Star Exterminator and Noise Exterminator before doing the auto stretch. So let's see what that would look like if I did that. So I'm going to just undo, we already saved a copy of this. I'm going to undo the histogram transformation. So we're back to our linear image. So I'll need a screen stretch to see what we're doing. And let's apply the blur exterminator first. And we can get to that through Process, All Processes, Blur Exterminator. And we'll just apply the defaults. And so again, I'll just click the square. Now, you can also apply this to any image by clicking on the triangle and dragging it onto the image. So just for fun, let's do this one this way. I'll grab the triangle, drag it onto the image, and let go. And so Blur Exterminator is now going to run, and it's going to do two things. It's going to sharpen the stars and remove any defects in the stars that it can identify, which it does mostly through well, not mostly, it does it through the deconvolution process, but it will identify point spread functions that are different along different axes, and then apply the deconvolution differently along those different axes. And it does it in different sections of the image rather than doing it all at once. So you have the advantage of kind of optimally adjusting each region of the image uniquely just for what it needs. And when it's done, you'll see the stars in it. Unless you were watching, you may not have noticed. The stars got a little bit smaller and a little bit rounder, and the nebula got a little bit sharper. So now I would stretch this image, and we'll go to STF again and go through the same process. This may come out looking a little bit different, but we'll darken the background, brighten the foreground, drag the settings down to the histogram transformation and apply that. And if you have the Russell Croman tools, such as Noise Exterminator and Blur Exterminator, we just ran Blur Exterminator, which sharpened the stars a little bit. So let's also run Noise Exterminator on this. And again, that would be under Process, All Processes, Noise Exterminator. And noise is one of the struggles with most astro images, that when you zoom in, you can see a fair amount of noise. Noise Exterminator, and I basically almost always use it at the default settings. When we apply that, it will intelligently remove the noise without blurring the stars or the nebula background. It really just cleans up the noise. And it also runs fairly quickly compared to Blur Exterminator. So this is still just a simple HOO image, but now we've just done very simple processing. And let's save this. And we'll save this in the same folder that we saved the last one. And we'll call this Simple HOO with Blur Exterminator and Noise Exterminator. So let's get a little bit more complicated now. I'm going to close this window, and I'll just go ahead and park this HOO version down here. I mentioned we could also create a hybrid version where we use RGB stars and do some more advanced processing on the hydrogen and the oxygen. And typically when I do that, I like to combine the resulting information in Photoshop for a couple reasons. It gives me more control, it's faster, and it's visual. You're not using pixel math where you try a set of parameters and then undo and try again. It's a very direct process. So let's go through that more advanced process now. And to do that, the first thing I'm going to do is combine the red, green, and blue into an RGB image. And to do that, we're going to use channel combination. And I'm also going to start using the shortcut saved processes that I have over on the right, which are just saved versions of the process that we used before. So let's open channel combination. And as you might guess, we'll drop red into the red channel, green into the green channel, blue into the blue channel. Click the solid circle to apply that, and that will create our new RGB image. And we're done with the red, green, and blue file. So I'm just going to go ahead and close those. And let's do a quick screen stretch on the RGB image. And again, we've got a very distinct color cast. So first I'm going to run Graxpert. And just as I did with channel combination, I have a saved process icon for the Graxpert script. So I'll just drag that onto the image. And Graxpert will run and do its thing of removing any gradient that it can perceive, but it'll also neutralize the background. Now this one we're also going to get a little bit more advanced. We're going to separate correcting the shape of the stars from sharpening the background. And in this instance, we're really only interested in the stars. So the next thing I want to do is apply this blur exterminator to correct the stars, but not worry about the background. And to do that, I have saved a process instance of blur exterminator where we've checked correct only. So I'll apply that to this image, and this will take about 30 seconds. Blur exterminator has cleaned up the stars, so we can close this. And now I want to run a process called spectrophotometric color calibration. And what this does is use a Gaia database of stars and star temperatures, which translates into color and composition, so that it can attempt to match the colors of the stars in the image to the actual colors that the stars should have. And it doesn't just go through and change each star. What it does is find a trend and then apply an overall white balance to the image so that the stars tend to fit the correct curve or the correct colors. So it's not going through and changing every star, but it's adjusting the whole image such that the stars have a good fit to the background. And when it's done, it gives you a little graph that shows the color that they should be versus the color that it came up with when it processed. And as long as those dots are falling more or less along a straight line, that's indicating that the white balance did a good job of fitting the correct colors. So now I'm going to stretch this image. So I'm going to go to the STF and update the screen transfer function to see what it looks like. And what we're really after here, and again, I want to have this linked, and I can use the scroll wheel on the mouse to also to zoom in and out. And because we're really looking at just the stars, I don't want the stars to be particularly big and bright. So I'm actually going to darken the stars somewhat. This image is really just about the stars. There's a little nebula showing, but ultimately it's just the stars that we want. And I'm also worried less about the background becoming pure black because we're not going to use the background from this. So we'll apply that transform and then turn off the screen stretch. And then the last thing we'll do with this is we want to separate the stars from the background. Now, they're already pretty separated. They can be separated even more. And I typically also run noise exterminator. So I'm going to go ahead and run both noise exterminator and star exterminator. And with star exterminator, I have it set so that it will save the stars using the unscreen process to remove the stars from the background. Star exterminator has finished doing its work. And so here is our stars only image. The stars removed from the background. So at this point, we'll save that. And I'll just go to File, Save As. And I'll go back to my Dreamscope Dolphin data. And this I want to save as a TIFF file. And I'm actually going to save this, in fact, as a 16-bit TIFF because we're still going to do additional processing and we want to have that additional bit depth for more flexibility. So we've got that processed and saved. Here is what was underneath all of those stars in the RGB image, and even though it was darkened down quite a bit, you can see there's still a significant amount of especially the oxygen data. So let's just move these little icons out of the way, and now we'll focus on the hydrogen and the oxygen. And I'm going to do something to to make my process a little simpler, because I'm going to do the same process on each one of these images, step by step. Rather than operating on each one at a time, I'm going to put them into an image container, and then when I process the image container, it'll run that process on both files. So I can right-click on the background and choose Image Container, and let's just reset it. And what we want to do is you can either add files or add views. And since these are open, these are views. So we'll click on Add Views. And there are the ones that are open, including the three down here that are shown as icons. So to choose, you just double-click on the one that you want to choose. So we'll choose the hydrogen and the oxygen, and then click OK. And now, much like we did before, I can use the triangle and just drag it out onto the background. And this icon now represents this set of images. And so now, instead of processing each image one at a time, I can process this image container, and it will process both images one after the other. So to start with, I don't know that we have much of a gradient in this, but let's go ahead and run Graxpert on it anyway. So I'll use my saved Graxpert process icon, drag it over to the image container icon and drop it. And now Graxpert will go through and run on each one of those images one after the other. Graxpert is done, so next I want to run Blur Exterminator. And where before, if you recall, we focused on just sharpening the stars, here I really want to focus on just sharpening the background. And to do that, I'm just going to open my Blur Exterminator process. And what I want to do is, instead of the sharpen stars, I'm going to take this sharpen stars down to 0 and let it focus on just the background. And so I'll grab my triangle now and drag this up to my image container and release it. And so what it's doing this time is going through and sharpening the nebula behind the stars, and it's using the stars to determine the point spread function, but it's not actually sharpening the stars. Now, normally I don't do it this way. Normally I just run it by default. And I have found when I ran this before that Star Exterminator left some fairly nasty artifacts around some of the stars where it kind of overdid its process and turned the star into a little dot with a black circle around it, or in some cases just a little black splotch. So I'm trying to avoid that by separating the process this time and running it on the background separately from the foreground. Hopefully that will solve the problem. There's really no reason to sharpen the stars at this point, because what we're doing is just extracting the nebula in the background. Now, I may still go back and process just the stars with correct only to get them as round as possible, so that Star Exterminator then has a better understanding of what are stars and what aren't stars, so that we don't have some residual from Star Exterminator. It looks like, I can't say for sure at this point, but I don't think that generated any of the black blobs. So now I'm going to run this again with the correct only. So it's only going to adjust the stars and make sure they're nice and round. And so again, this is the correct only version. I'll drag the triangle onto the image container and we'll let that run. The second run of Blur Exterminator is done. So we'll go ahead and close this. And as a disclaimer, I don't know if I'm using this the right way or the wrong way. Russell might tell you that this is not the correct way to do it, or that there's an easier way to do it. And processing data is rarely, at least for me, it's rarely a linear process. A lot of times you try something and then you back up and try something else. So when I produce these videos, you have the benefit of me already having found some of those blind alleys. So at this point, we have cleaned up the raw data. We've kind of tightened up the stars a little bit. We've sharpened the background. We're ready to stretch this image, and then lastly, we'll remove the stars so that we have starless versions of both the hydrogen and the oxygen. And we want to stretch each one individually. So again, we'll go to the screen transfer function and the histogram transformation tool. And starting with this is the hydrogen, I guess, that's on top. We'll find our sliders, and I'm going to darken the background a little. Again, we don't want it to be completely black, and then brighten the nebula. So stretching it a little bit more than the STF function did on its own. And then drag the triangle down, click the square to apply it. Image will turn white. And then we'll go to the other one, and we'll do the same process. We'll update the screen transfer view, darken the background a little bit, and there is some nebulosity. It's hard to see with the stars, but there is a significant amount of nebulosity in the background around the dolphin. So we don't want to squash that. We want to preserve it. And you can see a lot of it up here. What I think of as below the dolphin head, even though to me it's upside down, but to you maybe it looks right. So again, we'll drag this down. And I don't spend a lot of time fretting over these, because I always finish the process in Photoshop, and that's where I will fine-tune the stretch based on how it fits into the complete image. So we're done stretching. I can now turn off the auto stretch on these two images to see what they look like. The last step now, if you recall, is to run Noise Exterminator and Star Exterminator on these two images. And like before, we'll do that by dragging a process icon onto the image container, and we'll let that run. Star Exterminator is finished, and you can see it created two images of the stars, one from the oxygen and one from the hydrogen. And we don't actually need these for anything, so I'm just going to delete these. This is the hydrogen that we extracted. So this is the hydrogen only image, and this is the oxygen only image. And what we want to do is save these as 16-bit TIFFs and then combine them in Photoshop with these RGB, nice natural colored stars. Now, you can also do this combination in PixInsight, much like I did originally. You could combine these into an HOO image in PixInsight and then use pixel math to add the stars. There's nothing wrong with doing it that way. I prefer to do it in Photoshop, so that's what I'm going to demonstrate. So let's save each one of these. So this is the oxygen. And again, we need to navigate to the correct folder. And we'll save this as a 16-bit TIFF, 16-bit unsigned integer. And then we'll save the last file before we go to Photoshop. Save as, navigate to the correct folder, change the file type to TIFF, and change it to 16-bit TIFF. So now we're going to go to Photoshop and use those three files that we just created. So to start, let's go to, and I'll just close this one that I processed earlier with, this was processed a couple days ago with less data. And no, I don't want to save the changes. So File, Scripts, and Load Files into Stack. And what this does is let us load those three files as individual layers within one Photoshop document. And that's what makes it very easy to process. So let me just change the sort here. I always like to keep my folders in date modified sequence. That way my newest images are right on top. And let's go ahead and load these two JPEGs also for comparison. So we have everything all in one image. Click OK. So there's one of the JPEGs. And I don't know if you saw as it flashed packs, but it was pretty obvious which one was had noise exterminator and which one didn't.
Probably, yes.
So you never know for sure what order the layers are going to load. It's got the hydrogen on top, and that's why that's all we see, is because that's the layer that's on top, and it's in normal blending mode. And if you look at the drop down, there are a lot of different blending modes, and we'll be using some of these. If I turn off that layer, then we can see the oxygen underneath. There's the stars. And then lastly, here is our HOO image that we produced in PixInsight using Blur Exterminator and Noise Exterminator. And then lastly, here's the first one that we produced where we didn't use any special plugins. It was just a simple HOO image with Grexpert to neutralize the background. So the first thing I want to do is turn this over 180 degrees. So I'm just going to go to Image Rotation 180 degrees. And to me, I feel like that's the proper orientation. And that rotated the whole image, so it rotated all layers. The stars are kind of here in the middle, and we know we want those to be on top. So I'm going to grab this layer and just drag it up to the top of the layer stack. And now I want each one of my layers to be in its own group. And so we're going to be working a group at a time, ultimately, rather than a layer at a time. So to put this layer into a layer group, I can just use the keyboard shortcut of Control-G. And then double-click on the group name and name it Stars. And if you recall, I mentioned when we used Star Exterminator, we used the unscreen process. So to put the stars back in, we're going to use just the opposite of unscreen, which is screen. So I'll choose from the drop-down for blending mode. I'm going to choose the blending mode of screen. And at this point, we've kind of got the stars layer prepared, so we'll just turn it off. And I'm going to turn off this bottom RGB, the HOO. We'll look at these when we're done. So just ignore the bottom two. Next we have, this is the hydrogen. So I'm going to put it in a group, Control-G, and double-click to change the name to hydrogen. And then I'll just close this for now, and we'll do the same thing with the oxygen. Control-G, double-click. Change the name to something like oxygen. And eventually we're going to want the oxygen layer on top of the hydrogen layer. So I'm just going to grab the layer group, drag it up to between hydrogen and stars. So now we have our three layer groups with hydrogen at the bottom and oxygen on top. And I'm going to just briefly turn off the oxygen layer, and let's focus on the hydrogen because there's still some things going on here. The most notable is we've got a fair amount of glare from the filter from this bright star on the hydrogen data. And if you look at the oxygen, we don't have nearly as much of a problem with the oxygen, although we do still have some star artifacts. Now, we don't have to clean these up, but we will eventually. The other thing that we're going to want to do is uniquely adjust the brightness of the hydrogen and the oxygen. And since we've got these in separate layer groups, we can adjust the brightness of the hydrogen, the oxygen, and the stars all independently from each other. So to do that, let's start with the hydrogen layer, and I'm going to turn off oxygen for now. And if I click inside the group on the layer itself, and then come up to add an adjustment layer, and I'm going to use a levels adjustment layer. And when we add that levels adjustment layer in the properties panel, you can see the histogram. And the histogram is just showing how many pixels we have of each value between 0 and 255, which would be pure black and pure white. You can see we don't have any pure black and we don't have any pure white. In fact, we have kind of a gap here between the brightest pixel and pure white. And usually you want to get pretty close to pure white and pretty close to pure black. So to do that, I'm going to drag these sliders in. And what this is doing is brightening the bright pixels and then darkening the dark pixels. And I like to work with astro images on a black background. So again, I have a visual reference of what pure black looks like. So I know I don't darken the background too much. If I darken it too much and it starts to blend in, then I know I've gone too far. So let's say something like that, and then we can either brighten or darken the midtones. And now let's look at our oxygen. We'll do the same thing. I'll click inside, add a levels adjustment. We'll brighten the bright areas to almost white. We'll darken the dark areas to almost black. And then we may want to play with the midtone slider. But at this point, we're still working with two monochrome images, and it's a little bit hard to judge. So to turn it into a color image, and this is going to feel like magic. If you remember when we did channel combination, we got red from hydrogen and green and blue from oxygen. So a very easy way to do that in Photoshop is to use the layer blending options. And so on the layer group, I'll right-click to the right of the layer name, or the layer group name, and it opens the layer style dialog with the blending options by default. And you can see here in the center, it says channels RGB, and there's a checkbox by each one. What that's telling us is that this layer group has red, green, and blue channels, all three active. Well, if we turn off the red channel, then this layer is only going to have green and blue. So that means the red is going to have to come from whatever's below it. So let's turn off the red channel and watch the image when I click on this. Like magic, we have an RGB HOO image. Click OK. Now we can see what it looks like in color, and we can see that, well, the red probably needs to be a little bit brighter. So let's go to the hydrogen layer group, and let's brighten the red. And we can start to bring out some of that hydrogen in the background. And that gives us a much better balance. Now, we can even go a step further if we come back up to the oxygen. It's contributing green and blue, which makes cyan, which gives the Dolphin Nebula kind of a greenish cyan color cast. In order to make it more blue and less green, we can change the color that this layer group is providing. And an easy way to do that is I'm going to use, in this case, a curves adjustment layer. And I'm going to drop that right on top of the levels. And I don't want to affect the brightness. I only want to affect the color of this. So I'm going to change it from normal blending mode to color blending mode. So now this curves adjustment layer is in color blending mode. And the curve has a luminosity, just the straight line here showing how it goes from black to white. If we go to the green curve, now this is uniquely just the green that it's putting out. And if I grab the top right corner, or that slider, you'll see as I drag it down, we get less green, which conversely makes more blue. So you can just visually drag this up and down to get a color balance that you think looks good. And now we've got a nice contribution of hydrogen alpha in the background. Our Dolphin Nebula is nice and blue with the red hydrogen areas showing through. Let's come back up and turn the stars on. And let's do a couple things with the stars, because to me the stars are just too dominant. So I'm going to open this stars layer. And this, if you remember, within the layer group, this is the stars themselves, and we can turn these on and off. There's a couple things we can do to make the stars less dominant. One is we can just darken the stars a little bit more. So like we did before, we can add a levels adjustment layer, and just by moving the midpoint slider to the right, we darken the stars. And when you darken the stars, lo and behold, they get smaller and less dominant. The other thing we can do is we can use a filter to reduce the stars even more. So to do that, the filter needs to operate on the stars layer itself, but we don't want to actually change something that we can't unchange later. So to do that, I'm going to turn this layer into a smart object, which I got to by right-clicking on the layer and then choose Convert to Smart Object. Now I can apply filters that are non-destructive. So if I go to Filter, Noise, Dust and Scratches, and the radius here will determine how many stars it takes out. Are we taking out stars that are just the very smallest stars or medium-sized stars? Usually somewhere in the 4, 5, 6 pixel range works well with my images. And so what that did, we can turn this filter on and off. You can see it really just kind of knocks out some of those little noisy stars that are an irritation. We can also sharpen the stars to make them look a little bit more crisp. So we'll go to Filter, Sharpen, Smart Sharpen, and you'll see what we're actually doing here is we're adding another smart filter to this same layer. So now we have removed some of the little stars. We have sharpened the stars that are left because it applies them in order from bottom to top. And this is going to give us nice, more refined, a little bit crisper stars. And then the last thing I would look at, this star in particular, when we darkened it, we started to get a dark halo around it. And you can see if I turn off the levels adjustment layer, that's what's creating that dark halo. So let's not apply this levels adjustment layer, but let's not apply it just to some of these brighter stars. Let's let some of these brighter stars continue to be bright. And so to do that, we're going to use the mask, and we're going to grab our brush tool with 100% opacity and 100% flow, and black is our foreground color. And I'll use the left bracket key to make the brush a little bit smaller, or I could use the right bracket to make it bigger. But when I paint with black on the mask of the levels adjustment layer, you can see what it did. It just darkened or blackened the mask, which hides that effect. And let's do the same thing on just here and there on some of these other bright stars, and we'll let some of the bright stars sparkle a little bit. Maybe something like that. And lastly, let's add some color saturation to the stars. I'll add a hue saturation adjustment layer and just increase the saturation. And that gives us a little more color in the stars. Now we may want to do some global adjustments to this image. So if you think about our structure, we have our hydrogen group on the bottom, our oxygen group in the middle, the stars on top. So if we want to make a global adjustment to the hydrogen and oxygen without affecting the stars, what we want to do is add those adjustments above the oxygen layer group but below the stars. So with the oxygen layer group collapsed, I'll add a levels adjustment layer. We could add a color balance and a hue saturation. And let's darken the darks a little bit and just this is really the art of the process. So how much do you want to brighten? How much do you want to darken? Do you want to adjust the color any? If so, maybe you want, I think, a little bit of yellow blended in here. Looks good. If we want to adjust the hue and saturation, we can give it more hue and saturation. If you want to adjust individual colors within hue saturation, we can target, for instance, just the cyans. And we could, for instance, change just the hue of just the cyans to give that a little bit more of a blue. So at this point, I think that's looking like a pretty good image. We've managed the stars so that they don't hide the background. We've blended our hydrogen and oxygen together to create a nice image. If you recall, we sharpened the stars. Well, we can do the same thing to our hydrogen and oxygen. If I come down back into the hydrogen group, go to the hydrogen layer, right-click, turn it into a smart object, and then go to Filter, Sharpen, Smart Sharpen, just like we did with the stars. And I find that the nebula usually can stand a fair amount of sharpening, typically more than you would want to use on the stars. And really, most of our detail is coming from the oxygen. So let's do the same thing with the oxygen. We'll convert it into a smart object. And we'll apply Smart Sharpen to it. And I think at this point I'm going to call this a finished image. There is certainly more cleanup that you could do with, there's some star and more star residuals you might want to clean up. There's some satellite trails that could be cleaned up and so forth. But let's compare this to where we started. So this is our finished HOO image with RGB stars. And just for comparison, if we look at our original HOO image that we started with in PixInsight, that was our just simple HOO image that we combined hydrogen and oxygen in PixInsight, ran Graxpert to clean up, neutralize the background, and then saved it. So, pretty dramatic difference. This is after running Blur Exterminator and Noise Exterminator to clean up the image a little bit. So it's definitely better than the original, but certainly nowhere near, I think, nowhere near as good as what we got to with our more detailed and careful processing. Now, I'll throw in one kind of bonus point here. Maybe you really like the way the dolphin head looks, but we want to darken the red even a little bit more. There's two ways we could do that. We can darken the hydrogen to tone that down a little bit more, and that does a good job of darkening the red in the background, but it also darkens the hydrogen in the dolphin itself. Let's come up above the hue saturation, and I don't know how well this will work, but let's try select and select subject. Right here. And if we're lucky, PixInsight will, or I'm sorry, Photoshop, yep, see how it recognized that sharp dominant area as the subject. Now, if I add a levels adjustment layer, notice that it came in with a mask, and that mask by default selected the thing that was selected. And I actually want to select the inverse because what I want to do is darken this background. So I'm going to click on the mask and then invert the mask by using a keyboard shortcut of Control-I. Now, when I click on the levels adjustment and look at it in the process properties, if I darken, now I'm darkening just the background and really letting the nebula shine. And if we could even add a little bit of brightness, which adds a little bit more contrast, brings out a little bit more of this oxygen down here, and that really gives the image a little bit more pop. So you can think of that as a little bonus step. But this has gone on way too long, so I think this is probably a good time to stop. I hope you found this useful. If you have any questions, be sure to drop those in the comments below, and I'll try to address them. And as always, I hope you have a great day today and an even better night tonight under a clear, dark sky. Thanks.